In this last video, I'll discuss schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Schizophrenia is a psychological disorder that is characterized by major disturbances in thought, perception, emotion, and behavior. Compared to other disorders, schizophrenia is relatively rare. The lifetime prevalence in the US is only about 1%. The disorder can onset at any age, but it is most commonly first diagnosed during early adulthood in the person's early to mid-20s. The hallmark of schizophrenia is psychosis, which is a mental state where the person has difficulty distinguishing reality from what is not real. However, the specific symptoms of schizophrenia are wide-ranging and can present very differently in two different individuals. These symptoms of schizophrenia are often grouped into two major categories: positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Do you remember in Module 5 when we covered operant conditioning and learned about positive and negative reinforcement? Recall that positive and negative did not mean good or bad, but simply denoted whether something was added or taken away. It's the same idea here. The positive symptoms of schizophrenia reflect the addition of odd thoughts or behaviors that are not normally present, and these include hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia reflect the subtraction of things that are normally present, such as reduced or flattened affect and social withdrawal. Let's begin by talking more about some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. First, hallucinations are perceptual experiences that occur in the absence of external stimulation. That is, the person might hear voices that aren't really there, or see things that aren't really present. In schizophrenia, the most common form of hallucinations is auditory, usually in the form of hearing voices, but hallucinations can present with any of the five senses. Whereas hallucinations involve false perceptual experiences, delusions involve false cognitive beliefs. Delusions are beliefs that are contrary to reality and are firmly held even in the face of contradictory evidence. This is more than simply being mistaken. Delusional beliefs are clearly absurd, such as believing that your neighbor is an enemy spy who is plotting to kill you, or that you are the reincarnation of Elvis. There are three general categories of delusional beliefs: paranoid, grandiose, and somatic. Paranoid delusions involve the false belief that people or agencies are plotting to harm the person, such as the example where you are convinced that your neighbor is an enemy spy. People with paranoid delusions also frequently believe things like that they are being watched or that their thoughts are being monitored by government agencies such as the FBI or CIA. Grandiose delusions involve the false belief that one holds special power, unique knowledge, or is extremely important. Again, this goes beyond simply being arrogant. Someone with a grandiose delusion believes something obviously untrue, such as that they are very famous when they're not, or that they can wield special supernatural powers. A final category is somatic delusions, which involve believing that something highly abnormal is happening with your body, such as that you are infested with insects. In addition to hallucinations and delusions, people with schizophrenia also frequently experience disjointed and incoherent thought processes. These disturbances in thought are often revealed in a person's speech. For example, the person might have difficulty holding a single train of thought during a conversation, and instead quickly jumps to only marginally related topics. For example, if asked about receiving special job training, a person with schizophrenia might state that they once rode on a train somewhere. Although to us, these two topics are pretty unrelated, to the person with schizophrenia, the connection between job training and riding on a train is sufficient. On the extreme end, a person with schizophrenia might exhibit something called word salad, which is when the person talks in a way that is so disorganized and incomprehensible that it seems as though they are randomly combining words. A final positive symptom of schizophrenia involves disturbances in motor behavior. For example, the person may become unusually active, display odd facial expressions or gestures, or exhibit silly, childlike behaviors, such as giggling or self-absorbed smiling. In some cases, the person may exhibit catatonic behaviors in which the person maintains a rigid and bizarre posture for long periods of time, such as the picture shown on this slide. Moving on to the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Remember, these are things that are absent in a person with schizophrenia, but would normally otherwise be present. These include things like a lack of emotional expression, anhedonia, which is a lack of pleasure, avolition, which is a lack of initiative or motivation, and asociality, or social withdrawal. As a quick note, you might have noticed that most of these words start with the letter A. That's because A is a root, meaning without. So asociality, for example, means a lack of sociality. Let's pause for an application practice question. Mark is an ordinary person with no government connections. However, he is absolutely convinced that the FBI is constantly spying on him all of the time. This best exemplifies which symptom of schizophrenia? The answer is A, delusions. Remember, delusions are false cognitive beliefs, and here Mark is exhibiting a clearly absurd false belief that he is being watched by the FBI. Specifically, this would be a paranoid delusion. According to the DSM-5, a diagnosis of schizophrenia requires that the person present with hallucinations, delusions, and/or disorganized speech, as well as at least one other symptom for a significant portion of the time for at least 1 month. As you can see, the symptoms of schizophrenia can be fairly severe. Many people with schizophrenia experience significant difficulties in a number of day-to-day activities, and hospitalization is not uncommon. However, it's also untrue that people with schizophrenia cannot lead full, productive lives. For example, Dr. Ellen Sachs is a highly successful researcher and professor living with schizophrenia, and you can learn more about her story by watching a supplemental video on Canvas. So what if someone presents with some of the symptoms of schizophrenia but does not meet the full diagnostic criteria for a diagnosis? In fact, there are actually a whole group of disorders called schizophrenia spectrum disorders that all share related symptoms. So someone who does not meet the criteria for a schizophrenia diagnosis might still qualify for one of these other disorders. For example, a person who only experiences delusions, but not any of the other symptoms of schizophrenia, might qualify for something called delusional disorder. And a person who experiences psychotic symptoms for only a few weeks or days might qualify for brief psychotic disorder. And you might have noticed that the negative symptoms of schizophrenia have a lot of overlap with mood disorders, particularly depression. Someone who shows symptoms of both a mood disorder and schizophrenia might actually qualify for a separate diagnosis called schizoaffective disorder. Finally, we are not covering personality disorders as a whole in this module, but there are 2 personality disorders in which people display schizophrenia-like behaviors. First, schizoid personality disorder has overlap with some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Specifically, schizoid personality disorder is marked by extreme social withdrawal. This is not due to shyness or social anxiety. People with schizoid personality disorder are genuinely disinterested in other people. People with schizoid personality disorder may also show some symptoms like flattened affect and reduced capacity for emotional expression. Next, people with schizotypal personality disorder display odd patterns of thinking and behaving, but not to the level that it would rise to a schizophrenia diagnosis. For example, they may dress in a very eccentric or unkempt way, and their speech might ramble, or they might use odd phrases, or they might have unusual thoughts, such as magical thinking. Schizotypal personality disorder is also frequently comorbid with social anxiety, as people with schizotypal personality disorder may have difficulty understanding social cues or responding appropriately in social situations. So what causes someone to develop schizophrenia spectrum disorders? Well, like all the other psychological disorders that we have discussed so far, the causes are likely very complex and still not fully understood. However, there is considerable evidence that schizophrenia has a pretty strong genetic basis. For example, the risk of developing schizophrenia is nearly 6 times greater if one has a parent with schizophrenia than if one does not. Given this, it would make sense for there to be biological correlates of schizophrenia. And indeed, there is good evidence that the neurotransmitter dopamine may be strongly implicated in schizophrenia symptoms. Specifically, schizophrenia is associated with an overabundance of dopamine activity. Many of the current medications used to treat schizophrenia spectrum disorders are dopamine antagonists, which means that they decrease the amount and activity of dopamine in certain regions of the brain. On the flip side, drugs that increase dopamine activity can sometimes actually produce schizophrenia-like symptoms, like hallucinations. Other recent research has focused on another neurotransmitter, glutamate, which shows decreased activity in people with schizophrenia. However, these two potential explanations, glutamate and dopamine, might in fact be complementary because glutamate plays a major role in regulating dopamine neurons. While schizophrenia does appear to have a strong genetic and biological basis, there can also be environmental risk factors as well. In particular, several lines of evidence have shown a strong correlation between marijuana use and schizophrenia symptoms. And longitudinal studies suggest that heavy marijuana use may play a causal role in leading to the onset of schizophrenia. In this video, I discussed schizophrenia spectrum disorders. For the exam, you should be able to describe the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia and distinguish between them, identify the different schizophrenia spectrum disorders in an example description, and discuss the potential biological and environmental causes of schizophrenia.